All right, welcome to episode 26 of The Expert and the Idiot. Today I'm talking with Brian Vuillemenot. Hopefully I did all right with the pronunciation there.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Of Brian Boas. And you've been putting out educational content for Boas for quite some time now, right?
Yeah. So thanks for having me on your podcast, Adam. Great to be here. So yeah, I've started the channel about 5 years ago, right before the pandemic, and then had a lot of time during the pandemic to crank out videos and had a lot of ideas. And at the time, I saw there really wasn't a lot of really detailed BOA content on YouTube. I mean, there were people doing BOA videos, but I couldn't find a lot specific about locality BOAs, which I specialized in. And so my initial idea was just to make a video of each locality that I work with and say a little bit about my experience and show some animals on camera. Then I got into like kind of more general husbandry stuff. A lot of questions and comments came in from viewers, which were helpful in stimulating new ideas. So for the first couple years, I just was cranking out the videos, and I really didn't put a lot of time into each video. It was more like quantity rather than quality, which I guess YouTube is a lot of that is inherent to YouTube itself. But I think I was making about 3 videos a week for the first year and a half or so, and then started to get burned out, just ran out of topics.
Yeah.
And then, it got to the point where I was just doing the same thing again and again. And it seems like that's what a lot of YouTube is just repetition of the same thing again and again. And
yeah,
get to be like, what's the point, And I also saw that I had a few videos that seemed to be popular that people would watch again and again, but then a lot of the videos after, the first few days, no one watched it, and it was kind of discouraging. But I did, what was great about doing this YouTube channel is so many comments came in that, really made me think about things in new ways and, kind of go down different avenues with BOA keeping and really, influence my own keeping. And, as my breeding has ramped up, it's been great. Well, my BOA breeding, not my own breeding, but as the breeding has ramped up, it's been great for reaching out to people and talking about what I'm working on and what's going to be available. And, people can check in and, see what they might expect for next year's babies. Yeah. And, lately I haven't had as much time. I've just been so busy caring for babies and, getting them established and going. So I haven't made as many videos lately. I have these lists that I make of different topics that, pop into my head that I should make a video on. And sometimes I get to it, sometimes I don't. But yeah, that's kind of the YouTube thing. So it's a kind of an interesting experience. And I'm not really the type of person that would have done this because I'm more of an introvert and I more like to do my own thing. But, I thought it might be a good way to connect with people, and I've met a lot of people through it. So it's been quite the experience. Yeah.
That's awesome. So that was so 5 years of doing the YouTube thing. Now, when did you actually get into keeping snakes and boas specifically?
Pretty much my whole life. I mean, when I was as long as I can remember, I've been really into science and nature. And as a young child, I spent a lot of time exploring the woods behind my house and collecting, bugs and frogs and snakes and, whatever little animals I could find. And I was really drawn to reptiles. I'm not quite sure why, because no one else in my family is. Maybe it's just some kind of
same thing with me.
A gene, but it's, no one else in my family is. Yeah. And I remember when I was maybe 4 or 5, I saw this tank full of iguanas at a school, and I was just really blown away by that and so excited about it. And Um, and, I was really into dinosaurs as a kid. That might be another thing. Back in like the late 70s, early 80s, when I was a kid, dinosaurs were really popular. I mean, they're still popular, but
yeah.
And so, yeah, I was, I from a young child, I was trying to get my parents to give me a pet reptile, and had my first herp was a turtle when I was like 6 or 7 that my parents got for me. And then I had, a few smaller lizards, what they called chameleons, which were, of course, anoles. And then I got my first snake. I was maybe 12 or 13, had a garter snake. And then a few other, corn snake, a king snake as a young teenager. And then my first big snake was a Burmese python when I was in high school. I got my first boa about a year or two later. And really, was always loved the boas. There's just something about them. They're just really the sweet spot between a lot of different desirable characteristics. The size, they're big enough to be impressive, but small enough to be manageable. They're relatively easy and low maintenance, beautiful to look at, very enjoyable to handle and interactive. And I just, think that boas, and, when I say boas, I really mean what I call the boa constrictor group, which are the species that used to be boa constrictor. Now they've been reclassified as boa constrictor, boa imperator, and boa sigma. The other types of boas are cool too, but that's kind of outside the spectrum of what I work with, like Dumeral's boas and rainbow boas and things like that.
Yeah.
So I got my first boa. And then I was in college, and, because of my love of reptiles, I've always been interested in biology and decided to study biology in college. And then decided to go to grad school for molecular biology, and moved. I grew up in Connecticut, and did my college in Connecticut. Then moved to New Orleans, Louisiana for grad school. And when I was there, I started to, I always had a few reptiles, and at the time in college I was getting more into colubrids. I had several different types of milk snakes, and that was my first experience breeding reptiles. And then I decided when I was in grad school that I was going to focus on boas and pythons. And I think around 98 is when I've got my first Locality boa. I got a pair of Argentine boas.
Oh, my favorite.
Yeah, they've always been, if not my favorite, definitely one of my top 2 or 3, boa favorites. But I got those. I got a pair of jungle carpets and a pair of blood pythons, and grew them up. And I tried breeding them a few years later, and I really knew very little about reptile breeding at that point. I had the Reproductive Husbandry of Pythons and Boas by Ross and Marzak, which I still have, and is still one of my favorite breeding books, probably the best single reference on breeding boas that's ever been written. But I went by that, and a lot of it was just, pairing up animals. I kind of followed the general practices recommended in that book, but that book is about, all boas and pythons. It's not specific to boa constrictors. And, the first few years I tried breeding, I wasn't successful. I think the animals were just too young. That was another thing. We thought people didn't realize how long it really takes to get many boas up to reproductive capacity. And, 2 or 3 years just isn't enough.
Yeah.
And so then finally, actually, I finished grad school in 2001, and I moved to actually New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, to do a postdoc on lung cancer, the molecular biology and molecular mechanisms of lung cancer. And that's when I was really trying to breed the pythons and boas that I had. And I was finally successful in 2005. My Argentine gave birth, and it was actually shortly after I had moved to California to take a job in the biotech industry. And had a litter of Argentine boas, beautiful litter. like I said, I really didn't know a lot at that point. So I had basically the female was just kept under basically the same conditions I had been keeping her, with a heat pad and nothing really specialized as far as what a lot of breeders are using, and had the litter. And I actually had some difficulty selling them because at the time, Argentine boas really weren't widely appreciated, and people thought they weren't really colorful or really attractive looking. And I've always thought they were one of the most beautiful types of locality boas. But I remember placing an ad on Craigslist of all places, and I think I had them for like $100 or $125.
Oh my God.
And I remember people calling, and one guy called me and he was like, "Oh, that's not an Argentine boa. What are you talking about? It's a boa." But I had to deal with all that kind of stuff. And I sold a few of them. And then actually I went to the East Bay Vivarium in Berkeley. And being new to the Bay Area, I was excited to go check that out because they didn't have any reptile shops like that in Albuquerque or in New Orleans, where I lived before. And I saw they had Indian pythons, and Indian pythons had always been one of my bucket list species, being that I loved my berm when I had her, and it was nearly impossible to get an Indian python because of they're very hard to find in some of the laws around them. But they had them at the East Bay Vivarium, and so I had my eye on them. So I actually ended up taking I had a few leftover Argentine boas. I took them to the East Bay Vivarium and set up a trade, and traded 3 or 4 of them for the Indian python. And I still have that Indian python, and he's probably about maybe 12 or 13 feet. He's my biggest snake.
Wow.
And
how old is he now?
What?
How old is he now?
He's about 20 years old. He was born in 2004.
Oh, that's awesome.
But the East Bay Vivarium, as far as I know, they don't have any Indian pythons anymore. And even at the time, they had very few of them, and they didn't have females. Like, I was trying to get a female, so I never got a female for them. So actually, I recently got another pair of pythons. These are my only non-boa herps, the Indian, and I got a pair of Sri Lankan pythons, which I'm really excited about. And that was really another bucket list species. And somebody that I know ended up having some, and we set up a trade deal, and I got them. So they're doing great. So anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here.
That's
but
fine. Go for it.
I started off, I had my litter of Argentines in 2005. And then like the whole deal with Craigslist, and I kind of got out of it for a bit. Like I always had the snakes, but I really wasn't, like, I didn't really know anyone who did it. And being that I'm more of an introvert, I kind of more kept to myself, so I didn't really reach out or join any herp societies or anything like that. And ended up having another litter of Argentines in 2007 purely by accident. I was cleaning one of the cages, so I had a separate cage for the male and the female, and I stuck them both in the same cage while I was cleaning the other cage. And then I kind of got distracted and forgot about it for the rest of the day, and they were together for most of the day. And then I separated them, and then a few months later, the female started to appear gravid. And
wow.
They were only together a few hours. So I figured, it was probably pretty unlikely. And of course it was pretty unlikely, but sometimes luck is better than, skill. And she ended up having a litter of babies. And at that point, I didn't know about post-ovulation sheds or any of the things to look for. But she had a litter of babies. And so that was my second litter. And then, like I said, I had been out of it for a couple years, but I I think what ended up happening was I was trying to sell the babies, and I didn't really know a lot of avenues. And at the time, I was teaching biology at a community college, and I started to talk to one of my students, and it turns out he was into herps, and he's like, oh, you should go check out the online classifieds. There's fauna classifieds, and there's kingsnake.com. And so I went to these sites, and, I was going to put ads up there just to sell my baby Argentines. And I realized there were so many animals available. And like when I was starting out with Boas, 10 or 15 years before that, I had heard about true red tails, but of course I'd never really seen many of them, and they were nearly impossible to get. And, out of my price range, as when I was in my, teens and 20s. And I saw the variety of different animals available, and that they could be FedExed to me. Before that, the only thing I had FedExed, I had a pair of sulcata tortoises for a while. I got into tortoises actually when I was in grad school, and the tortoises were FedExed to me. But other than that, I had never, any reptile I'd gotten was either at a show or like a reptile store. And so I started going, and like many of us, I call it reptile porn, where you go and look at all the ads, and I'm more interested in, all the sites and all the social media. And I started looking at all these snakes and all these, these look so cool, and ended up picking out a Suriname red tail. And, I'd always wanted true red tails. And so I got my first Suriname in 2008, and I was just blown away. I mean, the pictures look nice, but seeing a snake in the flesh is just so much more of an experience. And after that, I decided to, grow a small collection. And at the time, I was focusing on true red tails. So I had a few Surinames, and then I got into the Peruvians. And I was going to kind of just focus on those, my original plan, but then ended up kind of going into some of the boa imperators. I got some hog islands and got a pair of the Honduran firebelly boas that I saw come up. And then it kind of grew into like pretty much any locality boa. I, expanded. I had, what I call the also boas, Almorali, Longicata, Saboge, and Occidentalis. And then I got into different island boas, Crawl Key, Corn Island, Cocker Key. And then I got into, several different types of red tails. And then ultimately I acquired some morph boas as well. So, the scope of my reptile efforts grew into like pretty much anything of the boa constrictor group. And, I had thoughts about, well, I really like carpet pythons and I like some of these other types of animals, but I was able to just resist and just focus on boas and just say, I'm going to just focus on this one type of reptile. I'm going to try to do it as best as I can and as more thoroughly as I can. Unfortunately, I just don't have the bandwidth for, carpet pythons as well. So I've just, other than the three pythons I discussed earlier, I focused on boas. But so then I had my first litter of red tails in 2014, the Suriname. So my original Suriname female that I'd gotten in 08 or 09, maybe it was, had her first litter. And I kind of got into this mindset, like it seemed easy, like had this really nice litter of 20 babies and everything went according to plan. And, I dropped the temperature as I had picked up online for what most boa breeders do, dropping the temperature for, a couple months during the winter.
How much are you dropping it?
Well, that's a good question because my thinking on that has really evolved over the years. Right now, I'm dropping it anywhere from at most maybe at 12 to 15 degrees just at night for about a month and a half to 2 months. But I say at most because for many of my animals, I don't drop the temperatures at all, and they seem to breed just fine. And my thinking on temperature modification as I've gotten more experience is that it's less and less necessary. And I think a lot of the reason why people drop temperatures or why they did this is it was kind of a carryover from breeding colubrids, because of course you do that to induce the males to breed, because a lot of these animals have a more of a winter, and it's necessary for their reproductive physiology to drop the temperature. But I think with boas, a lot of boas seem to breed just fine without doing that. And when you look at the environment of where a lot of these boas live, it doesn't really make sense, from their, environmental perspective, from their natural habitats. And the other issue is that the environment of boas in the wild is so varied. I mean, it's anywhere from northern Mexico in the mountains all the way to Argentina. And I mean, it's millions of square miles of North and South and Central America where these animals live. So there's a huge range of different habitats. So it's kind of ignorant to just think you're going to do one thing and it's going to be the ideal conditions for all of these different animals. This is kind of what I've done, though, even keeping boas from all these different environments. I've treated them pretty much the same way. Like people often ask me, well, your crawl key boas, what is the specifics about those? Or, your, Lonchicada boas. But really, I pretty much handle them all very similarly, and they've all seemed to do reasonably well. I mean, some of them seem to need higher humidity, or the red tails don't do well with high heat. So I keep them on the cooler side a lot. But overall, I've just used pretty similar husbandry. And I think what's happening is boas are adapting to captivity more and more with every generation. And I mean, it makes sense that boas would become adjusted to captivity over multiple generations, because it's in their best interest, and it's in what, the keeper's best interest as well. And what originally happened was that when people started keeping boas and getting wild-caught animals, a lot of them just didn't, make it in captivity. They just didn't hack it. They didn't have the either the genes or the inclination to really do well in captivity. And I personally haven't acclimated any wild-caught animals, but there's a pretty large failure rate with bringing wild-caught animals in. A lot of them don't make it. So you might be talking about 50% of the animals end up dying in the first year. Unfortunately, when you're talking about wild-caught animals, the remaining 50% are going to be different, than the other ones most likely, and they have the genes and the behaviors that are adapted to captivity, right? So, but when you magnify that generation after generation, and we're also talking about breeding abilities and inclination to breed in captivity, every generation is going to be more and more adapted to captivity. And when I see people talk about pure locality boas and pure this, pure that, I kind of chuckle about it in a way. It's because pure can mean so many different things, right? And people get into locality boas. I mean, part of the reason that locality boas exist is the purity and keeping them, genetically the same as the wild animals. And I completely subscribe to the mentality, and I've, done my best to make that possible and keep my animals, pure. But nothing is ever going to be pure, because we're breeding them in captivity, and they're changing in captivity, and they're fundamentally different than the wild animals. And for someone to say that their animals are pure, and that, kind of implying that they're essentially unchanged from animals in the wild, it's just ridiculous. So what's that?
It's like it's almost like saying a dog is purely, exactly what a wolf is out in
that's
the
a
wild.
good comparison, because dogs are obviously they've been changed by their relationship with humans, and dogs, of course, have a longer relationship with humans, so they've been changed, quite a bit more than Boas, but it's really not that I don't think it's incorrect to say that many Boas at this point are really domesticated animals.
Mm-hmm.
These morph Boas, I mean, they're so much different from a wild animal. I mean, the differences between like many of these combo morph Boas and their wild ancestors is like it's probably more than the difference between like a domesticated rat, like a white rat, and like a Norway rat, or even cats. I mean, domestic cats are genetically very similar to the wild cats from which they're descended. So I really view, especially morph Boas, I view them as domesticated animals. And
yeah, I have an IMG Motley boa, and there's just you look at it and it's like, this is not a boa. Like
yeah,
obviously it is, but it
but it's
just
so
looks
different. It's so different from
so different.
a wild Colombian boa. And I mean, it's one thing to say, well, it's the appearance is different. Yeah, that's a big part of it. But it's also its behavior is different. It's just not the same thing. And I think you hear a lot about these laws about exotic animals and about, you can't keep wild animals as pets. These animals are not wild anymore. They're domesticated animals. I think this is what the message has to be. When we have these laws that are trying to restrict keeping reptiles as pets, they're domesticated animals at this point, and it's no different from a rabbit or a chicken or a cat. So
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I think
I breed rabbits.
oh
And one of we'll bring them. We have two kids, and we'll bring them inside, and you can put them on the couch, and they're very easy to litter train. That and you sit there and you look at it, and it's like, this is nothing like a wild rabbit that's
yeah
outside. And one of the previous hurricanes that came through, we had an abandoned baby rabbit, and our neighbors took it and tried to take care of it, and it actually broke its own neck in the cage because it was
yeah
just so terrified and high strung. Whereas these rabbits, you can go in there and pick them up like a cat, and they're enormous too.
yeah.
So yeah, it's a completely different
Well, yeah,
animal.
and many boas and pythons are like that. They get after I don't 10, 15, however many generations it's been, they're so different behaviorally than their wild caught ancestors that they're really not the same thing. I mean, so
Yeah.
I think people have to look at reptiles like that. But getting back to what I was talking about with the morphs and the localities, unfortunately, there's really no way to ever keep any locality 100% pure and unchanged in captivity because of not just our own desires. I mean, people obviously they have a certain look that they're breeding for, and they're going to select the babies to take to the next generation and breed that have that look. And even if they say they're not, and they're trying to preserve the wild look or whatever, there's no way around that. But even if it was possible not to have any of that, captivity itself is selecting for certain behaviors and certain things that do better. Just the fact that a snake will breed in captivity, whereas other snakes will not breed in captivity, it's going to change, the genes of the next generation. And I mean, I've seen that myself. I mean, with breeding boas, sometimes you'll have a pair of boas and they look totally healthy and they're old enough and really well conditioned, ready to go, and they just won't breed.
Mm.
And there's really not a whole lot you can do. I mean, I think a lot of people that get into reptile breeding, they have this idea that they can change, they can control everything, and they can have the environment perfectly set up, and they can get everything exactly how it should be. I don't know how they understand how it should be, because nature is always changing, and nature is millions and millions of different ways. It's not like you're going to say that there's an ideal set of conditions, right? There's just what works and what doesn't work. But a lot of times people will ask me questions, and it's almost like they think there's some kind of master plan to breeding boas, and there's like this ideal way. And, some people who've been successful have figured out this ideal way, but there's not. I mean, it's just trial and error, persistence, and luck. And I think that anybody that really sticks with it is, in the long run, is very likely to be successful. But I think a lot of people just don't stick with it long enough, and they're not willing to do the sacrifices and put in the work that's really necessary. I've seen a lot of people come and go in boas and reptiles in general, and I've seen so many people that just get really, really into it in a very fast period of time, and they go from having like, one snake to having like 50 in a year.
Yeah.
And then they realize like how much work it is and how much their life changes. And then maybe their life, something else happens in their life. They have a new girlfriend who doesn't like the snakes, or they have a life change, a job change, and then they just get out of it completely. But I've seen people that get into it, and maybe they kind of build up slower, and they get to the point where they have a really nice collection and they're starting to breed, but then it just gets to be too much. And it's just keeping reptiles and breeding reptiles is a sacrifice. And the more that you're into it, the more that you have to sacrifice other areas of your life. And this is something I've been grappling with a lot over the last 10 years. And, after I got a few morph boas about, 10 years ago, I said, I'm not going to really grow the collection anymore. I'm going to have my holdbacks, but this is it. This is all that I can handle. And I had a really diverse collection. I had almost pretty much any locality boa that was commonly available. Like, I didn't have some of the rarer ones that you almost never see in captivity, like the clouded boa or the Ortonii boa, or a few of the more rare subspecies. But I had most of the localities, and I had quite a few animals that are really rare now, and actually they were rare back then, but I think many of them are even rarer now, unfortunately.
Can you give me some examples?
Well, one example are the Corn Island boas, and these seem to have gotten like really popular in like the last year or two. I see all kinds of people asking about Corn Island boas. And I had a pair of Corn Island boas I got about 10 or 12 years ago, I'm guessing. I'd have to check my records. But they were just up on fauna classifieds, and they were there for a very long time, and they, no one seemed to be interested in them. And I kept looking at them, and, they kept dropping the price. And I'm like, I kind of wanted them, but, even back then I was kind of trying to restrict myself, and not get carried away with what I added to the collection. And I ended up, acquiring the pair, and they had been bred by a guy, Tommy Carpenter, and I had, talked to him a few times through Facebook, and I kind of reached out to him and just to confirm that they were really his, because it was someone who had gotten them, and then they were just, selling them for whatever reason. They had to get out of reptiles or whatever. Yeah. So then I had the Corn Island pair, and then they were cool boas. And what's great about them is they're small. I mean, they only get to be about 4 feet long. And they have kind of a cool greenish red coloration, almost like Christmas colors in a boa. And I bred them. I had a litter. It must have been around 10 years or so ago. But I ended up, it was a small litter, maybe 6 or 7 babies. And I was keeping back some holdbacks for a while, but then, I sold most of them. For whatever reason, I decided to sell the holdbacks. And then unfortunately, I lost the female. I think it was related to the breeding. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I ended up, she unfortunately passed away about a few months after the breeding. And then I ended up selling the male. And, a lot of people are probably going to, get mad at me for this. I sold it to someone as a pet. They were just looking for a pet boa. I had this boa, which was a Corn Island boa. I didn't have anything to pair it with, and no one really seemed to be that interested in them. So I sold it to somebody. I don't know what ended up happening to it, but then a few years later, suddenly people were reaching out to me. Oh, do you still have Corn Island boas? What's going on with the Corn Island boas? And then like lately on social media, I see all kinds of posts and people are acting like it's the holy grail of boas. And I mean, don't get me wrong, they're cool boas, but I think really this only has to do with the scarcity. I mean, if there were like thousands of them and everyone had them, there would be no desirability. And that's a really bad mentality to have around boas or any animal, really.
It's so common with snakes though, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that really rub me the wrong way about the reptile industry, but just this whole monetary value people put on reptiles and how obsessed people are with the financial side of it is just really a huge turnoff for me. But so people were reaching out to me about Corn Island boas and do I have them? And, a few breeders reached out to me and I said, sorry, I got out of those. And of course I started to think, geez, I should have stayed in, if I had realized how rare these were going to be and how hard they were going to be to find. Luckily, I know that some of my babies that I produced are still in collections. And I know, one person in particular who has some of them, and he is, a really good keeper and is planning to breed them, and they should be ready to go in the next few years. And so hopefully he and a few other people that have them will, keep the locality alive, in the captive boa hobby. But that's the sad thing. I mean, there's a lot of these locality boas. There's only a few people working with them. And there's essentially none coming from the wild because most places where boas live are totally off limits to any kind of export. And so when you think about it, even if you keep everything 100% pure and you don't crossbreed with anything that's not 100%, related to it, whatever that might mean, ultimately you're going to have inbreeding depression and you're not going to have a sustainable population in captivity. And it's probably only a few generations. So ultimately, unless there are, fresh blood coming in to enrich these captive populations, these locality boas are really not going to remain pure or viable, for the long term. I don't know what the answer is to this. I think some people take the whole purity thing way, way too far, and they confuse purity of a locality with purity of a bloodline. And I see a lot of people that refer to boas not just as, a red-tailed boa or common boa or even by the locality, but by the bloodline. And they almost use it as like a marketing badge. It's like a fashion label, like, someone wears, Nike or,
Gucci,
some famous brand. They use like, Fudo or Rio Bravo, or, they throw the bloodline in there. And then, it kind of adds to the perceived value of the animal and the exclusivity. But you can't just keep breeding the same animals from the same bloodlines. You're going to run into issues with inbreeding. And people often ask me about inbreeding. Do I do inbreeding in my boas? Yes, I have bred siblings together. I have inbred when it's made sense, but then it's always very important to, as much as you can, to outcross and to introduce new genes and keep your populations diverse. So
you have the you still produce the Argentines, right? And I know you have the Max Pink line, and he advises that you kind of outcross, right? Because
and that's one of the reasons I got that Max Pink animal. And, thank you for bringing that up. But my Argentines, I had my original pair from '98, and then I had the last litter they produced was in 2015. And then unfortunately, I lost my original pair a few years later. They were around 20 years old.
Hmm.
But I still have some of the babies from that litter from 2015. And I bred one of the females back in 2023. She had her first litter. So she was 8 years old and had the litter. But yeah, I bred her to the Max Pink male. And Argentines are kind of like the poster child for, the whole locality boa, what I call kind of the boom and bust cycle of locality boas, because for many, many years, no one was interested in them, and they were not really viewed as a really desirable animal. And if you can go back on fauna classifieds, you can look at ads from 20 years ago, and the prices many of these animals were selling for is like a pittance compared to today. Like, Argentine boas were generally in the $100 to $150 range for quite a while, in the early 2000s up until like the early teens. And then they just seemed to have caught on. And I saw that the prices started going up, or, around the mid-teens, because I was looking for a male, because I had some female holdbacks from my 2015 litter, but there were no males in that litter. It was a small litter. And I couldn't find a male. And I saw Bob Guerrier's site, Ancient Reproductions, where he's got his selective Max Pink and a few other Argentine projects. And, I started looking at those, and those seemed really cool. And they were a little bit expensive for me, because but then, I noticed that the prices of many Argentine boas started going up, and they were harder and harder to find. And so I got the male, and I think that was probably around 2019 or 2020 that I got that male. And because he was a couple years old, that's another attractive thing, is he'd be closer to breeding age because he was already, about a year and a half or 2 years old.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, this, from what I know about the Argentine boas, there were a couple shipments like in the late 80s or early 90s. And then because of the CITES, it's like a CITES category 1 animal. So all exports became banned. And so there wasn't a huge group, of bloodlines to work with. And I know Bob, he's been working with his for quite a while too. So his probably, I would imagine they would have to trace to some of the animals that came in back in, I guess, the late 80s or early 90s. Because as far as I know, there haven't been any more that have come in.
Yeah, I have a pair that I just got that are Fortune line, and those were supposed to have been smuggled in. I don't know exactly where they got smuggled in from, but they came into, I think, LAX, and they were confiscated because of the CITES, and then Edgar Fortune reproduced them.
Okay, so these came in after early 90s then, like recently, or?
Not, I need to I want to get Edgar on the podcast so I want to get the story from him. I want the real story.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're I think like the least related line that's in the country. And so those went to, I think it was the Seattle Zoo, and that's where Edgar worked. So I'm hoping to sort of outcross, I have a 3-year-old female that I plan on eventually breeding with this pair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea. I didn't even know that there were some more that had come in. But yeah, I mean, so you kind of raised another issue there about animals that come in illegally, and we've heard stories about certain animals that have come in, and obviously we want to do this legally. I guess you could have a whole separate conversation about the ethics about having animals in your collection that ultimately were sourced illegally.
Yeah.
But then you look at the other option, there's really nothing available. And, it gets into some kind of, tricky issues to sort out. Ultimately, if some of these countries would just allow a small number of animals, a few dozen to be exported a year, that's all that we would need. And the very, very, very sad thing is that thousands and thousands of boas are dying probably every day, getting hit by cars due to deforestation and forest fires. And you look at the collective impact of humans on not just boas, but all species. The daily losses, when you think about it, are just staggering. So, looking at, a few dozen animals a year to go into captive reproductive programs is, to me, it doesn't seem like it would be a big deal at all. But
yeah, especially if they're going to zoos, right?
Yeah.
Where they're ensuring that that it won't be, people won't be hybridizing them and doing silly things, where they'll actually be preserving the animal for the way it should be, and getting new blood into the gene pool that way.
Yeah, I think the problem is some people view zoos as being unethical, or it's for entertainment of humans, or people just kind of take the whole animal rights agenda way too far, and it's kind of a sad situation. So I don't know what the future is going to be for some of these pure locality boa projects. Like I said, I'm doing my best to maintain animals as pure as possible. But just the very fact that they're in captivity generation after generation is going to make them essentially different from any of the wild animals. I kind of think about it in the way that locality boas eventually are going to become just morph boas, because they're basically going to be like our own captive impression of what, for example, a Suriname boa should be. And, everyone has this idea what a Suriname boa should be. It should have, peak saddles and long red tail and connected saddles or whatever. But people are going to select animals that kind of embodies that vision. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a part of selective breeding. But every generation, it's going to be a little more like what the ideal captive idea of what that particular boa is supposed to be like. And at some point, you got to think, at what point is it really no longer representative of what the original wild animal is? And it's really now just basically a morph. It's like a captive version of a Suriname boa, or the captive impression. Yeah. And a lot of people ask me about Guyana versus Suriname boas and what my thoughts are on those. And I've made at least one video where I kind of delve into that in depth. But I would say, purely from like a biological or scientific perspective, that there's really no difference. I mean, they're not just the same species and same subspecies, but it's really a contiguous population, because you don't really have a geographic boundary that's really separating boas from Guyana from crossing with boas from Suriname. But as far as a captive impression, there's definitely this idea about what one should look like or another one should look like. And there's really like different bloodlines are going to look different. And I had one Guyana pair that I still have. Actually, a friend of mine is actually going to be taking them in a few months. Since I'm kind of focusing more on fewer projects and, trying to kind of pare down my breeding efforts. But the Guyana pair that I have, it's from a bloodline from Mike Eckert, and they look completely different from Suriname boas. I mean, the tails are not bright red. They're kind of more of a maroon brick red. They kind of have this really wild look, a lot of background markings and speckles and really peak saddles, but kind of jagged and asymmetrical peak saddles. So I got this pair because they just looked really different from Suriname boas. But I've seen many Guyana boas that are the same thing. I mean, there's no way that you could tell based on any morphological characteristic that they're any different. And really, there's a lot of the untold secret about locality boas is very, very few people can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what they have is actually from what they're claiming it is. They're just going based on what the breeder that they acquired the animals from is telling them. And, they say, well, we have the CITES document, but that doesn't really mean anything, because it's just a piece of paper that said, there were boas exported out of Iquitos, Peru. It doesn't even have a picture of the boa. So it means very, very little. Maybe not nothing, but it doesn't really mean a whole hell of a lot. So really, the way I look at it is that if you acquire animals from people who you can trust and people who, have a good reputation, and they've done their best to preserve the documentation and the records, and they're not lying, they're being honest with and straightforward with you and telling you what they know about the boa, that's, about as good as you can do. There's also, I go to the iNaturalist site a lot, and, if you haven't been there, I recommend it. But iNaturalist is where people will take photos of not just reptiles, but any animals and even plants, and they upload it to the site, and they have the GPS information. So you can go and you can search for different types of snakes in South America. You can do a search, boa imperator, and you can look at all of the different people who've uploaded the photos, and you can see exactly where it's from, right? And these people, they're not reptile breeders, so they don't have any vested interest. They just want to upload their animal pictures. And what I found out is that by and large, most of the pictures of the wild animals do look quite a bit like our captive versions of them, or our captive descendants of them, I should say. And so that gives me more confidence that, what we're working with is the real thing. I've seen some examples where you have a wild caught animal from, let's say Peru, that looks nothing like many of the Peruvian boas that we have in captivity. And it's not necessarily that there's, anything shady going on. It's just that our captive animals don't nearly capture the genetic diversity of animals in the wild. And that kind of gets back to what I was talking about with the whole purity issue and the whole considerations you have to make when breeding boas over multiple generations. The animals we have in captivity are a small percentage of the total genetic diversity. It's something called the bottleneck effect, where we have such a small founder population that all the animals that are descended from those original founders are going to be considerably different genetically than the wild animals, because the original founders were not representative of the whole captive population. So, and then when you don't have any fresh genes coming in, it just, makes the whole issue, it magnifies the whole issue.
Yeah. It's interesting, especially you touched on it before, just that the animals that reproduce in captivity that were wild caught it's like unnatural selection, where or natural selection. I don't know how you'd state that, but like my Timor pythons that I have are captive bred from Ryan Young. He bred them 2 years in a row, right? And a lot of people have difficulties breeding them. So granted, Ryan Young's really good at what he does with pythons, but at the same time, I'm hopeful that I'm getting animals that are more likely to breed in captivity, and that if I can breed a couple generations of these, that they're going to be less defensive. They're not going to be as musky. They're going to, kind of calm down and domesticate, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you hear that in the retic community. A lot of the reticulated pythons were just, pretty rough when they first started out, and very defensive. And now they're gigantic puppy dogs.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that trend is only going to continue. And, when I burned my head back in the 90s was very, very tame, and, it was kind of like a big puppy dog. But I remember reading books that had been written from, the 50s through the 70s, like the Clifford H. Pope book, Giant Snakes. Was talking about how many of these animals are very hard to handle and very, aggressive, and And my experience was that with the captive animals that they were completely different. But I remember looking at retics. I've never had a retic, which is probably a good thing. But I remember looking at them when I was a teenager and really, really wanting one. And but I hearing everywhere how impossible they were to deal with and how aggressive they are, and how difficult. But it's clearly not the case, and many people have them. And when we're thinking about 25, 30 years, it's not that many generations.
Yeah.
So they have completely changed. But I would think that over time, these animals are going to become even more and more adapted to captivity. We were talking about the cycling. It may have been necessary previously to do the cycling to induce breeding in many reptiles, and now it's no longer necessary because they've just adapted to captivity so much that they don't need that anymore.
How are your Sri Lankans? Are they pretty feisty?
No, they're not. So their behavior is completely different from my boas, which is kind of one of the things I like about them. They're very active and they're very inquisitive and they're very interactive. They look at me through the cage and follow me around. And when I go up to their cage to take them out, they kind of come and they anticipate me. And there's definitely a lot going on in their brains. I mean, these are smart snakes. I mean, not that boas aren't, but I see these animals and it's like a whole nother level. It's like they're just really intelligent animals. But they're very active though. Like when I take them out, they move around quite a bit, and they'll even hiss once in a while. But it's not like a hiss like a boa where they're being defensive or they're telling me, to back off. It's just kind of how they express themselves.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. So I got a question. I love watching your videos. Anytime I have any interest in any kind of boa species, especially like the Argentines and stuff like that, you'll show animals that are 7 or 8 years old, and they're not ridiculously huge animals. Which sometimes I see videos and I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Getting this animal, and it's going to be hard for me to put this in a 6x2x2 or something like that. And then it would be reassuring to see your animals that have really good body condition. They seem like they're muscular and they're more like athletic looking, but on the smaller end of the spectrum. They don't look nearly as monstrous as some animals I've seen at shows and things like that. Is that intentional? How do you feed them and
people,
all that?
Yeah. So a lot of people have asked me about that. And, the first thing that is making this is that I rarely take out my big boas on video because I'm one guy and I'm trying to pay attention to the camera and, keep my train of thought going while wrangling a boa. So,
so you do have giants.
I wouldn't say I have giants. I mean, I think boa size is greatly over exaggerated. But, dealing with an 8-foot boa on camera versus dealing with a 5-foot boa is two totally different experiences.
Yeah.
And, I've done a few videos where I take out my larger boas. So hopefully that gives people kind of an impression of my, the largest ones that I have. But, and I've heard people ask me about some of the boas. Some of them just don't have the genetic potential to get big. And everyone thinks true red tails are these giants, and they've seen these pictures of these, 12, 13-foot ones, which certainly exist, but trust me, they're extremely rare. It would be like a 7-foot or 8-foot human, right? It's about the same likelihood. But I have this Argentine or Suriname boa that she was born in 2014, and I got her shortly after she was born, and I grew. I initially was raising her just on a regular schedule. I feed about every 2 weeks or so for my true red tails when they're growing up, and she just didn't seem to be growing very well. And even when she was around 3 years old, she was still maybe 2.5 feet.
Wow.
Like this boa had only put on maybe like a foot in like well over a year, like, probably 2 years. I didn't take any detailed measurements. And so I thought, well, is there something wrong with this boa? Why is she growing so slow? So I started increasing the feedings, and I was feeding her at one point about once a week. And she seemed to be getting kind of chunky from that, but she wasn't growing longer. She was just getting chunkier. And so then I kind of backed off the feeding a bit. And she seemed to be doing perfect otherwise. I mean, she seemed like she was in good health and beautiful looking animal. And she finally got to be about maybe 4.5 feet when she was around 6 or 7 years old.
Wow.
And then, I had held off on breeding her, but I first paired her up in 2022 when she was 8 years old, and had a really nice litter, around a dozen babies. And actually, I held a couple of those back because I think, maybe this can be like a dwarfish line of Suriname. And a lot of people were excited because they wanted to get a boa, a red tail that wasn't going to get as big. And so I told them, well, the mother's only about 4.5 feet long. And trust me, she hasn't been stunted because she's in perfect health and had this beautiful litter. And I bred her again this year in 2024 with a different male, and had another really beautiful litter. And so, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a genetic component to the size of boas, and many of them just don't have the genes to turn into a 10 or 11 foot boa. I mean, I would think that, relatively few actually have the genes to do that. Diet is also certainly a component, and what I've seen in the boa hobby is this pendulum swing between back when the morph craze was starting, like back in the 90s. There's the whole power feeding where people would just feed animals to grow them up as fast as possible, which obviously was not a good thing for their long-term health. And then there was kind of this reaction to it, and it became like the slow grow movement where people were like, no, don't overfeed it. Don't feed it that much, and like I was kind of taken aback when I first got, after I had my Argentine litters, and then I got my red tail, and then I kind of got back into the whole herp community online. I was kind of taken aback by this whole mentality about slow growing, and it was almost like people took it as a badge of honor how little they fed their animals. Like they're more hardcore herpers because, my boa only eats 6 or 7 times a year, and maybe that's an exaggeration, but I kind of thought that was strange. And my first red tail that I got, I was feeding her basically based on my experience with other snakes I've kept, and I fed her probably more than most people would recommend now. I was feeding her close to once a week when I first got her. And then I think when she was an adult, it was more like every other week. But this animal, I bred her at 5 years old, had a perfect, beautiful, perfect litter. She got up, maxed out about 7 feet long. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just genetic. The boa has its capacity to get to as big as it's going to get. But the whole feeding thing, I mean, one of the most common things that people will ask me is about feeding. And people have this idea that there's this ideal formula, and every boa has to have this ideal amount of food. And it's just so not what happens in nature. I mean, in nature, there's a very limited amount of food, and boas are going to eat whenever they see food. And the ones that eat the most are the most likely to be successful and, go on to reproduce and live to adulthood and things like that. But there's not this ideal feeding schedule. I mean, there are things that work and things that don't work. And feeding 2 or 3 times a week to get your boa to breeding size in a year and a half obviously doesn't work in the long run. And feeding, once every 6 weeks also doesn't work. It's just common sense. So I tell people, your boa should grow slowly but steadily. Most boas are going to put on anywhere from 6 inches to 18 inches a year. Most boas are going to take a bare minimum 3 years for males, 4 years for females. More likely, 4 years for males, 5 years for females to get to the size where they can reproduce. And I know, like, a lot of morph breeders will claim that they breed much younger, and I've seen people claim that they breed males at 18 months. And I know I'm not doubting that happens. I mean, people aren't lying. This is their experience. Yeah. My experience is I haven't been able to breed animals anywhere near that young. I think the youngest I tried, it's been about 3 years for one of my morph males I tried, and he didn't show any interest. And then the same animal bred successfully the following year when he was a year old. But it's just common sense. I mean, your boa should grow slowly but steadily. And it takes, boas are slow growers. They take a while to reach reproductive age.
How big are your Argentines?
So my Argentines, my original pair got up to around 8.5 feet.
Dang.
Right now, I've got my one female who's a 2015 baby. She's about 8 feet. I've got another female. I ended up getting another pair back when the prices started to go up around the mid-teens, and I got this really nice pair, and I think they're 2019 babies. She bred for me the first time this year with my Max Pink male, but this female is pretty big. She's must be about 8 feet, maybe a little over, not 8 feet now, but she's still growing. She's put on probably at least a foot in the last year, and she's gotten quite a bit bulkier. Like she's like the muscles. She's just. I've got an 8-foot cage on the way for her. She's going to need it, but yeah. So I mean, they're all different, and Argentines are one of the larger types of locality boas, but even the true red tails, many of them just don't get that big. The Venezuelan true red tails. I've got some adult Venezuelan true red tails, and they're in the 5 to 6 foot range. And trust me, they haven't been underfed or slow grown. I mean, they've been fed in order to maintain a healthy body condition. Yeah. So some animals just don't have the genetic potential to get big.
So when you have like I had some issues with my pair of Argentines regurgitating, and I'm not sure what it was, because I changed 2 things as soon as it happened. I reduced prey item size. Actually, I changed 3 things. I reduced the prey item size, I reduced the frequency of feeding, and I increased the heat. So I don't know which one of those fixed it, unfortunately.
Well, those are, probably the 2 main things that cause the regurgitation. And I'd say that, you can see this in any type of boa, but it's most frequently in the red tails, the true red tails. And I think the most frequent cause is that people are keeping the animals too hot.
Oh, too hot. Okay.
Yeah, it can be too cold also. That can cause regurgitation. But most frequently, what I've seen, somebody has a boa and they have it on a heat pad, and they don't have any kind of thermostat. And, the hot spot is like in the upper 90s. And that's the most frequent thing that causes it. So I keep the hot spot of my boas, especially my true red tails, no hotter than 90. It's typically around 88 or 89.
Okay.
When you keep it in the mid to upper 90s, I mean, that's the most likely way you're going to induce a regurgitation. Typically, the boa will be under a year old. So true red tails sometimes, they'll eat a few meals and then they kind of get into this regurgitation cycle. The heat will be too hot, and then maybe somebody feeds them too frequently. And baby boas in general, they don't need to eat that often. You're not going to starve a boa if it doesn't eat for a few weeks, right? But they have this regurgitation event and they panic, And the inclination is they want to feed it again as soon as possible, because then hopefully it's going to keep the food down and they're going to feel better, right? But that rarely, if ever, happens. Usually what happens when you feed a boa after it regurgitated, if you don't wait at least 3 to 4 weeks, it's going to regurgitate again. And even if you solve the other issues with the temperature or the prey size, if you feed it too soon, when it regurgitates, it's traumatic and it's caused irritation of its, its throat and mouth, and that has to heal, and it has to go back to a healthy state before you feed it again. But typically, if somebody has a second regurgitation, it makes the whole cycle much, much harder to get out of. And at that point, maybe the person waits a few weeks, but now the boa is starting to lose weight, and it's just a baby boa, so it doesn't have that much in reserve. So unfortunately, if you have a second regurgitation, it really makes it a lot more likely that the animal's not going to make it. So what I tell people is wait 3 to 4 weeks. Resist the urge to feed again, because that's the worst thing you can do when a boa has regurgitated. But double check your temperature, because a lot of times people will set the thermostat and the thermostat says 88 and they don't bother checking the actual temperature. But the temperature at the hotspot could be drastically different from what the thermostat says, right? So you have to make sure you check it with I have this laser gun thermometer I use obsessively to check temperatures constantly. Make sure to check that. Make sure get smaller food items. The other thing, if your boa it has a big bulge in it, that's too big of a food item. You want a food item that's going to leave barely visible bulge, if a bulge at all. And then you want the first meal after the regurgitation, you want to feed a smaller than normal, like one size less than you normally feed. And then the quality is also important. People in general feed frozen thawed, which I 100% recommend, and virtually all of my adult boas are going to get frozen thawed. It's only the baby boas, when they're starting out, some of them are very difficult to get started feeding on frozen thawed. So I use the live, like fuzzy mice for most of my island boas. But the quality is very variable. When you order rodents from a commercial source, sometimes they're just not that fresh. And I think that if a rodent has been in the freezer for a while, it starts to get kind of funky and freezer burnt, and it just doesn't have the right smell or taste. And maybe boas don't seem that picky about what they eat, but their digestive system is going to react differently to old food that's been in the freezer for 6 months or a year, right? So typically, if I had an experience with an animal regurgitating, I try to get as fresh as possible. So, typically I'll use a fresh killed animal for the first feeding after they had regurgitated. And I think it definitely makes a difference when you have, a fresher prey animal.
Yeah, I think it could have been multiple things. I think I might have been keeping too cool because I had my thermostat set for 90, but it's on top of the heat tape under the tub. So when I was temp gunning it, it was like 84 to 86.
Yeah.
And so I went up to 92, just a small 2-degree difference. And that brought it up to more stable 86, 88. And then I went from like a hopper mouse or a small mouse, and fingers crossed, haven't had any issues since then. And it was both of them. And who knows, maybe I fed them too soon after they arrived at my house too. So it could have been stress. I mean, it could have been so many things.
Stress is definitely a big thing. And, I always tell people, make sure you have a hiding place where the boa can retreat and get away and just be in the dark. And don't pick up your boa. Just leave it alone. Let it acclimate when you first get it. Because I think, if someone gets a new boa, they're really excited. They want to take it out and show everyone and take pictures. But the boa just needs to acclimate and it needs to unwind. And, think about it. It's been in this little box for almost a day, or maybe in some cases longer than a day, being shipped out, and it's in a completely new environment, and it's got people poking at it, and it's got a new cage. The last thing it wants is that. It just wants to be away from the humans, and
Yeah.
just give it some space, right? But there can be multiple things that contribute or cause the regurgitation. There's also, I've realized there's multiple types of regurgitations as well. The most troublesome and what we hear about, the most common, I call the type 1 regurgitation. I made a video about this a couple of years ago, but I actually came up with a system of classifying boa regurgitations. But the type 1 happens in baby boas, typically 6 months to a year old. And it typically happens 3 to 4 days after they are fed. And you have a kind of a wet, slimy looking, but still fully formed mouse. And it smells absolutely horrible. The smell is really what gives it away. And this is really the most worrisome type. And this is what most people are dealing with, and what we've been talking about. But sometimes boas will just regurgitate like these hairballs almost. And I've noticed when this happens, it's more like around a week after feeding, and it's just like hair. It's just like almost like a cat would regurgitate a hairball. And what I think that is, it's just, the system has taken in too much food lately. So it has to kind of unburden itself a little bit, but it kind of regurgitates just the hair. And maybe that's caused by if the feeding is too much, or there's something about the prey item. But those types of events are nowhere nearly as worrisome as the first type that I talked about. But then there's also another type, and I fortunately haven't seen this, but I've heard about it. And it's where somebody feeds a prey item that has some kind of toxicity. And the animal, typically it's an adult animal, and the adult animal will violently regurgitate with a lot of fluid, and it's very traumatic. And if you go look at some of the old forums, like the Reptile Insider Forum, which is a boa forum that was really popular. I think it shut down about 10 years ago or stopped being active, but there was a lot of good information there. And that's where I learned a lot of the information when I was starting out. But there's this type of regurgitation where the boa eats a bad rat and violently regurgitates. And then some people claim that it causes this reaction in the skin, like scales fall out and just really weird things. And then the animal typically ends up dying. Jeez. And when I read this, I was kind of like skeptical of it. It just sounded really, really fishy to me. And they claim that it was linked to a certain type of rat, which is called a Zucker rat. And Zucker rat is actually a model of diabetes. So they're called fat rats, right? And so they express certain genes that make them morbidly obese.
Whoa.
And so supposedly, or so, the rumor was that some of these commercial rodent suppliers had somehow acquired these Zucker rats. And they basically look like a black and white hooded rat, but they look really, really fat, right? And at the time, I was kind of skeptical because commercial rodent suppliers are not getting rodents from the same source as like laboratory rats. It's just, that's a common misconception that rodent suppliers are using, excess lab rats from the biomedical industry, but that's just not the case. Mm-hmm. But anyway, somehow, supposedly, they'd gotten some of these fat rats, and a few people claim they had fed one of the fat rats to an adult boa, which was otherwise completely healthy, and that it regurgitated violently with all kinds of fluid and became completely dehydrated, and its skin fell out, like its scales fell off or something, and then most of these animals ended up dying. And I have a good buddy who was really into boas for a while, and he told me he had the similar thing happen where one of his adult boas ate a bad rat, and he's still not sure exactly what was wrong with the rat, but it violently regurgitated with a lot of fluid, and he was convinced that the boa wasn't going to make it, but the boa ended up pulling through and recovering from that.
Wow.
So yeah, that's a very troublesome. Obviously, if you see something like that and your boa has been gotten something toxic in its food, you want to consult a vet and provide supportive care to hopefully get your boa through that. But yeah, my point is that there's not every regurgitation is the same, and some are going to be more of a worry than others.
Yeah, I almost think my female was sort of a 1.5, where she ate and was 4 days. It was 4 or 5 days later, and when she regurgitated, it was like 3/4 of the mouse was digested.
Yeah,
and just the back end was not.
yeah,
And so it was just like you could see a fully formed tail and like hips, and then the rest was brown, and digested. And that I think could have been temperatures. It could have been stress. She didn't arrive in good condition. She came in a Tupperware container, covered in her own urine and feces and halfway shed. So she not, she didn't, she came in, what condition, she had to have been very stressed out from being in that condition arriving, and then I waited for her to shed, and I probably fed her too soon. Then the male I was feeding once a week, and up comes the hairball that you described, like the type 2. And so I immediately said, no more of that. And it was 3 weeks I waited, and then I gave him another smaller prey item. And now I'm doing every 2 weeks and kind of taking my time with feeding them. And I don't look at them. I don't touch them. I think I've taken them out once to clean, so it's very, very brief, but just, I'm more concerned about them just being relaxed and getting food in them right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds good. And, from time to time, these things happen. And, usually it's not that big of a deal. But I just tell people, just don't feed them again too soon. Just, wait a few weeks. And then, and you can handle animals. It's a matter of giving them enough space, and every animal is going to be different.
Yeah. And the Argentines are they're a very stressed out little snake when they're babies, with the hissing and all that. And I went in and did a brief little mist, just a tiny bit of extra humidity in there, and the male bit the spray bottle.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. No, they vary a lot, and when I first got into Argentines, I was reading everywhere, they're aggressive and they hiss. And my experience has been the opposite. Even my original pair of Argentines from, 30 years ago, they were, I never once have I ever been bitten or struck at by an Argentine. There's been some hissing, but you can pick up a hissing Argentine and it just hisses. They don't do anything, to try to bite. And then I see it as well with the babies. The babies will hiss a little bit, but it's the Argentines are one of the, strangely, those in the Tarahumara, which are the other dark boa that hisses, those are the two babies that never, ever will bite me. I can stick my hand in the enclosures when I'm going to take care of my babies and, clean the cages, clean the tubs. Never, ever will any of them. I just pick it up and, change out the paper towels and clean it up and just put it back. Like with my baby Surinames and my other red tails, those will strike at me. And a lot of my morph babies will strike at me. But the Argentines and the Tarahumara, they'd never, ever bite.
It makes me wonder if when he struck at the spray bottle, if he thought it was food. Because it's, it was like a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. And
well, it could be, or it could just be, your animals are genetically different from mine. So their behavior is going to be different.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
In fact, I don't think I've ever been bitten by either of those. Actually, I was bitten by a tarahumara once, an adult. Almost any time I've ever been bitten, it's just been kind of a feeding accident. I mean, it's pretty easy to avoid being bitten by a defensive snake. I mean, all you have to do is just keep your hand away from the head. And it's how all of these, these snake showmen that you see on all these TV shows, they handle all these highly venomous snakes, but they're just careful to keep their hand away from its head.
Yeah.
But it's when you don't expect it that you're going to get bitten. And almost any time I've been bitten, it's been just servicing animals, cleaning cages. I'm just going from one to the next on my weekly routine. And I just put my hand a little too close, and the boa is sitting there calmly, and I'm not expecting it, and then I get hit.
Yeah. Is that generally that's just a food response, you think?
Yeah, I think basically they're expecting to get fed, because these are animals where had I just kind of alerted them that I was going to pick them up and maybe tap them with a snake stick, they would have been fine. They wouldn't have bitten me.
Yeah. So what's the difference between BC and BI?
So from a husbandry perspective, or
Yeah, like how do you treat them differently? What and also, just as animals, how are they different?
I'm going to assume by BC you mean like BCC, like true red tails versus the non, like the Colombian boas and the Central American imperator. So in general, the boa imperator are more laid back. The husbandry is a lot more forgiving. They're, as far as pet qualities, they generally have a lot more of the pet qualities, an animal that someone wants to handle and take out and have as a pet. The BCC, while I wouldn't say that they're difficult, I mean, they have the reputation of being, more challenging husbandry. If you do everything right, they're pretty easy to keep, really, and even breed. But the problem is there's a much more constrained range of conditions. You can't keep them too hot. You have to give them their space. You can't feed them too often. They have to have the right humidity. So they're a lot less forgiving of deviations from, ideal husbandry. And I think often people get into boas and they see the true red tails and they're just blown away by the beauty and the long red tail, and they want to get it. And I tell people there's no reason why somebody can't get a true red tail, even as your first boa. However, it's going to be a lot less forgiving of any variations from the ideal husbandry. It's going to be less handleable in general. Not necessarily aggressive. Very few of my boas are what I would call defensive or aggressive, but just less. They don't enjoy handling as much. They're more high-strung, maybe a little bit more nervous. They're going to squeeze your hand or arm a lot tighter, and if you have a big boa squeezing around your arm, it can hurt a little bit, anytime a big boa squeezes my hand, my wedding ring on my left hand gets caught between my fingers. And because the ring is kind of poking against my other fingers, it can hurt. If you have a 7 or 8 foot boa squeezing the hell out of your hand, that's, quite a bit of force.
Yeah.
And it's just doing that to hold on. It's not doing that to, hurt you or to attack you. But I tell people, and I really stress that probably the best general purpose pet boa is going to be a Colombian boa. And it certainly could be like a branchia or like a locality specific Colombian, but it can just be a regular, normal pet store garden variety boa. It's probably 80-90% Colombian. I mean, there's really no way to tell. But these are just the most laid back, forgiving boas. They don't mind handling. Many of them seem to even enjoy handling. They're forgiving of non-ideal husbandry, easy to keep. That's really the boa that you want to get, as far as a pet. Some people that have gotten the true red tails, maybe they've encountered this regurgitation and they haven't been successful, and it kind of destroys their whole experience with boas. Whereas if they had just gotten a more forgiving animal, like a Colombian boa imperator, they would have had a different experience.
Where did the Occidentalis fall into that realm for you? Do you think that they make a good pet? That they
Yeah, I would say they're more like the boa imperator.
Yeah.
Just more forgiving of husbandry, and because they're from farther south, where it's kind of more of a temperate environment or subtropical, they're more forgiving and more tolerant of like cooler conditions.
Yeah, and my female, my 3-year-old, she loves coming out. I mean, she loves coming out of her cage. She loves being held, and is very relaxed. Like, doesn't really do a good job of even holding on to me. Like I can put her around my neck, and she's just totally content.
Yeah, the Argentines, they definitely have a different build than the true red tails. They don't hold on nearly as much, and they're also an Argentine that's 8 feet long is going to be quite a bit thinner than a true red tail that's 8 feet long. They just have kind of a slightly different, more round body, and a little bit more elongated. It's interesting, like different types of boas have completely different body shapes. And like the most extreme would be the Pearl Island boa, the saboge, which I believe is now a subspecies of imperator. But they're really elongated. It's almost like a carpet python, or a reticulated python. They just have this very long body, and an 8-foot saboge boa isn't going to be that thick. It's only going to be a few inches in diameter, whereas an 8-foot true red tail would be, twice that girth.
Yeah,
it's just interesting to see.
So we talked about the temperature cycling. Do you cycle food, and what does that look like when you do?
Typically, I just stop the feeding for about a month and a half to 2 months. And it just coincides with the start of the winter. And so basically my feeding cycles from now, I start in November. I've actually moved it back. When I first started breeding, I didn't pair up until late December. Now I pair up in early November. And that's really made a difference as far as when the babies are born. And I would much rather have my boas born earlier in the season than later, because it's more time that I can acclimate them to hopefully find them new homes that same year. Because once you get to, late November, early December, you can't ship to most parts of the country for a few months. So starting in November, and in fact, I'm going to start very soon here. I've got one more feeding, and then that's going to be my last feeding for the year for most of my boas. And then starting in November, for a few of them, I'm going to drop the temperature probably about 10 degrees this year. I haven't quite figured out how. It's probably going to be less than I dropped last year. And I'm probably only going to do it for about half of my animals. I mean, last year I only did it for like half my animals, and the rest of them they bred fine. So if I have a boa that shows any sign of a respiratory infection from temperature cycling, I never drop the temperatures again. That's one reason I wouldn't drop the temperatures. And then I don't drop the temperatures on any of the morph boas. And they seem to breed just fine with no cycling at all. And by no cycling, what I will say is that there's a natural seasonality. As the fall approaches and the days get shorter and it gets cooler, even if you have your thermostat set the same setting, it's going to get cooler, right? It's just because of nature. So, the snakes can kind of pick up on that. And then they're going to stop feeding in November. They won't feed in November. And typically I start feeding them again in early to mid-January. It varies. I mean, my subadult snakes, often I'll stop feeding them for like a month and a half. Like I don't stop feeding as long as the adults. And then typically I won't stop feeding any boa that's less than a year old. I just feed those regular cycle over the winter. And so I do that till January. I start my pairing as soon as I start the cycling. So like After I feed them, I'm going to feed them again probably in a week, which will be the last feeding for the year. I'll give them a couple of weeks just to digest and, get settled. Then I'll start to drop the temperature slightly. Typically, I drop a few degrees at a time. Every week I drop it a little bit more. And then once I get to about 10 degrees normal, that's about where I go. So basically, actually, it's more like 15 degrees in the past. Basically, my hot spot is usually set to 88 to 90, and the cool side of my enclosures falls between 75 and 80 for much of the year. And most of the enclosures, I just use like a FlexWatt type heat tape or Ultratherm type panel, or not panel, it's like a heat mat underneath, right? A few of my larger enclosures, I have like a heat emitting panel. But for most of them, I don't need any kind of ambient heating, because just having that FlexWatt on one side will actually increase the temperature throughout the enclosure by a few degrees. And because the background temperature of my snake room is usually around 75, it kind of gives me where I need the cool side to be. When you have so many of these heating devices in a small space, even if they're just not really heating the ambient temperature that much, when you have so many of them in there, it raises the ambient temperature by between 5 and 10 degrees over what my home heating would be. So there is some effect. But basically, in the past, I've just dropped the temperature down to where the hot spot gets down to 75 at night. That's as cool as I go. I do that for I think from 8 at night to 6 a.m. is and I have Herbstat thermostats, so it just cycles automatically. And then during the day, it just goes back to the normal hotspot temperature of 88 to 90. And I do that until January. Then I start raising the temperature. And I've kept the animals paired the entire time. So starting in November, they'll be paired up until January. I just keep the pairs together. I don't feed them. I check in on them and, service the enclosure about once a week, change out the water. But I just let them do their thing. And my philosophy on breeding is you get the animal ready as best you can, and you do all your homework, and you do your best to make the setup perfect, but then it's up to the animals. And once you have that pair together, they're either going to breed or they're not. And there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do to change that. And I think people in general, they want to have this guarantee that their animals are going to breed, or they want to have more control over the process. I don't really even follow very closely. Like you hear people talking about like a pre-ovulation swell, and the animal's ovulating, and then you got your post-ovulation shed, and like all of these milestones which have been figured out. Basically, I look for the post-ovulation shed. I mean, that's really important for me, because you count 105 days from that shed, and it tells you within a week or so of when the babies are going to be born. And it's usually pretty good. About 90% of the time, it's pretty accurate. But often I don't see the animals ovulating, because many locality boas, the ovulation can be kind of subtle. And I'm not checking in on there every day. Like, I just give my animals the space. I tend to be maybe more secretive than some other breeders. Like, I don't like taking a bunch of pictures of animals where they're breeding, and I don't like announcing to the world exactly what I'm doing. And I see a lot on Facebook. You see these pictures of people claiming, well, yeah, this boa is having its, post-ovulation swell or whatever, and it's like, I feel kind of like I just want to keep that more between me and my snakes, and then I just let them do their thing. And what happens is that when I pair up my animals, maybe a third to a half of them, I see pretty quick signs of interest. The male is courting the female and, trying to mate with the female, and they're trying to line up tails. Other animals, I see absolutely no signs. I see the two animals together. They're not interacting. The male's on one side of the enclosure, the female's sitting on the other side. But I just leave them in there. And what I've realized is that what you see does not necessarily correlate with what you get as far as babies. Because often those pairs where I see a lot of apparent activity, the female never becomes gravid. And then I see often no activity at all, and yet the female starts acting gravid a few months later and has the post-ovulation shed. So I think some animals are just stealth breeders. They just want to do it, in their privacy, and they don't want to be bothered, and they want to maybe they just do it at night when I'm not around, But I try to give them their space. I don't check in every single day on every pair. I just let them do their thing. And so what I've realized happens is that after a few months, many of the females will start to act gravid. And typically around, so they've been paired in November. Oh, I should also mention that after I stop the cooling in January, I start feeding again. What I'll do is after that initial, 2.5 month period that they've been together, I separate them out and I feed all of my breeders. And then I keep them separate for about a week, let them digest their food. And then I put them back together for about a month. Mm-hmm. And then I just repeat that process. After a month, I separate them out, feed them, put them back together. And so typically by early spring is when I start to see gravid females. And I start to look for when they're going opaque, because obviously I want to record the dates of the post-ovulation sheds. But they go into the shed, and typically it lasts longer. It's between when they start to go opaque and they shed is usually about 2 weeks. And that tells you it's post-ovulation shed, not the regular shed cycle only takes about half that time. Mm. And usually at that time, the male also stops showing interest in the female. And then the giveaway is the female will be coiled over the hot spot in a tight coil. And, you pretty much know you have a pretty good shot that the female's gravid at that point. But typically I'll leave the male in a little bit longer. I want to be absolutely sure that the male is done and that I've given it the best chance. But usually around early spring, around April, May is when I start to get the confidence that I have some gravid animals. And actually, since I've been pushing back the start, I've been starting to have earlier births. I think my earliest litter ever this year was on March 20th.
Wow.
So still technically not quite even spring, right? That's the end of winter, or the very, very early spring. I had my Pearl Island boa litter that was born. And I was surprised because this female, and Pearl Island boas in general, they seem to breed really easily, and females give birth really quickly, like before all my other boas, even though they were paired at the same time. And I've noticed this with both of my breeder females. And they both have been kind of a surprise, because both of my last two Pearl Island litters, I thought that the shed that happened after the post-ovulation shed was the post-ovulation shed. So sometimes you have the post-ovulation shed, but then you have another shed that happens, a month or two later. And I thought that was, so I wrote down plus 105 days, and I had it in my record book. And then I go, and I'm surprised that the babies were born early. But really what ended up happening was I had misidentified the shed cycle as the post-ovulation shed, when it had actually happened the previous shed cycle. But even my true red tails, like typically my first litters will be born around May.
Okay.
And like when I first started breeding, I was having the true red tails. It was more like August, September. But now the true red tails are born May through August. And most of my boas last year were born in July. I had that really, really busy July. I had 1 week where I think I had like 6 or 7 litters in 1 week. It was crazy. But then it kind of calmed down, and my last litter, I only had 1 litter in August, which was the Suriname that I was talking about before, the dwarf one that's like 5 feet long at 10 years old. But she had her litter in August, and beautiful litter. And that was my last litter for 2024. So I've just been super busy just getting these animals going and selling them and shipping them out. And it's just taken, like, I haven't had much time to make videos lately. Like, even if I had the desire to make videos and the topics to discuss, I just haven't had the time because of all the baby boas.
It's interesting because if I ever want to know something about a boa, you know, or I look something up on YouTube, a lot of your videos come up, but they might be 2 or 3 years old, you know, but it's still great because it's relevant information.
Oh, yeah, no. Thanks for saying that. I mean, that was the goal of the channel, was just to kind of get together this repository of knowledge and, you know, try to get, like when I first started it, another objective was just because people were asking me questions about baby boas they got from me. And so I thought I could answer everyone's questions and have like a series of videos I could refer people to when they had a specific question. And this is just what works for me. This is just my own experience.
Yeah. Everyone
has their different experience. Everyone does it differently. I don't think there's really a right or wrong for many of these things. You know, you go on social media and you get this impression of the group, this kind of groupthink, where everyone thinks that there's like this perfect way of doing things, and that if anyone does anything slightly different, they're a bad person, or there's something wrong with them, or they're evil, or whatever. I mean, there's so many topics that, like, for example, cohabitation. You know, people have this idea that this is like the most evil thing you can ever do, is keep more than one animal in the same cage. And frankly, it's just kind of ridiculous, because how the hell do you breed boas? You have to keep them both in the same cage, right? So
yeah,
there's just no, I mean, yeah, maybe for the majority of times for pet keepers, it doesn't make sense to do this. It's just, there's very few absolutes, black and white things in boa breeding. It all depends upon your situation. So I know what works for me. And, you know, I started off just by, you know, reading articles in like in Reptiles magazine, for example, or online or in books. And then I just kind of, every year, I just kind of took what worked for me, and I stopped doing what didn't seem to be working, and kind of adapted how I was doing it year after year. You know, and I've gotten to the point, you know, I'm not perfect at it, but I feel like I'm better than I was. And I understand the process, you know, quite a bit more when I started. You know, there's certainly more to learn and, you know, more to improve upon. But this is just works. It's what works for me and my boas and my situation. You know, living in Northern California, the local environmental conditions here are obviously different than, you know, many other parts of the country. So I would urge people to, you know, try to get as much information as you can. Try to, you know, get as much experience as you can from other people who've been doing it. But then, you know, take what works for you and get rid of what doesn't work for you, and just, you know, do this year after year after year, and kind of, you know, figure out your own way. I mean, there's so many people that just seem to be so reliant upon what other people are doing, or they have this idea that there's some kind of recipe. They want to read a care sheet or a recipe for how to breed something, and they want to just replicate that 100%, and that's going to work. And it's just a ridiculous mentality. You have to just do what works for you, you know, and what works for your animals and your situation.
Yeah, being in Southwest Florida, it's going to be a radically different set of parameters than what you have. I mean, I'm in a very humid environment, and you know, I could run into problems very quickly if I miss too much or anything like that. How do you maintain your humidity and everything?
So humidity, I have a room humidifier. It's like a cool mist humidifier, and I just run that during the day in my snake room. I don't get obsessed with humidity. Like, typically I don't measure humidity. Like, I have a few humidity gauges. I've got one in the room. but I don't like have one in each enclosure. Usually, if my snakes aren't having shedding issues or there's no reason why I would be worried about it, I don't worry that much about humidity. I use the coco coir mulch or substrate. It's basically the coconut husks, which have been ground up. And it's really good at maintaining humidity because it soaks up moisture. In fact, it can be too humid. You have to kind of let it dry out after you reconstitute it with water.
Yeah.
But I have that in probably 80% of my enclosures, and it seems to really help with the humidity. And generally speaking, don't really worry about it that much. I mean, once in a while, I'll have an animal that has shedding issues, which I'll soak the animal. And then I'll make a point of adding a little bit more moisture to the coco coir. Sometimes I spray down the enclosures if they look like they're kind of dry, just to keep it humid.
Okay.
I usually do that on my when I'm going through each enclosure every week and servicing it. I'll usually kind of, if it looks like it's dry, I'll spray it down a bit.
So what do you recommend for enclosure size from baby through adult? Do you have like guidelines that you give to customers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically guidelines would be, if you can provide 1 foot of cage space for every foot of snake, that's ideal. If, the bare minimum on the lower side would be the length and the depth of the cage, like a 4 by 2 foot cage would be okay for a snake up to like 6 feet long, right? It varies by type of boa. Some boas are a lot more active, like the Pearl Island boas are a lot more active than, say, the true red tails. So, and Argentines tend to be a little more active as well. I know I'd feel comfortable with a true red tail of a certain size in a slightly smaller cage than some of the other types of boas. For my babies and subadults, most of them I'm keeping in rack systems with homemade racks of various sizes. Starting out with like shoebox size enclosures for the newborns. And then I have, I don't know how, I think I have like I don't know if it's 28 quart rack. The tubs are like maybe 1.5 feet by about 1 foot.
Yeah.
But I have some subadults in those, the slightly larger ones. I have some racks with these boa tubs. It's like a 30 by 40 inch boa tub. And I keep some of my smaller adult, like my dwarf boas and island boas in those, and some of the subadults of other types of boas. And then I've got them in plastic, commercially available snake cages, anywhere from 4 to 8 feet long, depending upon the size of the animal.
What are your thoughts on lighting? How important is it? Just day-night cycle, and then also UV lighting.
I don't provide any kind of supplemental lighting for each individual cage. I have ambient lighting. I've got fluorescent lighting in the room. I've got windows so sunlight gets in. But as far as full spectrum bulbs, I don't use any of those. I know that there's a lot of debate about that. I haven't had any health issues. I mean, my snakes have bred and they've all been, quite healthy without it. I don't know if there's any health. I've seen some people sent me papers about supposedly, there's one study where corn snakes were able to have a higher vitamin D level when they were exposed to full spectrum sunlight. To me, I have no idea how that actually translated to the health of the animal. I mean, my own experience keeping corn snakes, I never had any kind of lighting like that, and they were always fine. I've seen the whole, sometimes these types of debates get a little nasty, and I've seen kind of the most ridiculous example would be somebody keeping an albino boa under full spectrum lighting, because this is a snake that's missing its melanin pigment and it doesn't have protection from ultraviolet, and it doesn't make sense. Back we were talking about domesticated snakes, and people have this idea of that they want to replicate what's in nature and that's somehow good. but really it's not. One of my favorite things I like to tell people, even when I was teaching biology, was that nature wants to kill you. Things in nature survive in spite of nature, not because of nature, right? So if we really wanted to do things naturally, we would have to kill off 90% of our babies in the first year, because that's what would happen in nature. They'd be eaten by predators, right? So it's just a very ridiculous debate to try to claim that we want to do things naturally. I mean, what we're doing is not natural. We're breeding animals with genetic mutations in a captive environment. Why the hell would we want to replicate what's happening in nature?
Yeah.
It makes zero sense. So
think of all the husky keepers that would have to turn their AC way down.
Well, yeah, and I mean, would you want to keep your husky on the Alaskan tundra, to replicate the environment of the wolf? It would make no sense, right?
Yeah.
I see very nasty debates online where someone has decided that if anybody doesn't do what they think is the ideal husbandry, that they're somehow an evil person. And I totally don't participate in those types of things. And when I first got on social media in 2015 on Facebook, and I was sharing pictures of my animals and connecting with people that way, but pretty quickly I realized just how negative a lot of it was. And that's one of the reasons I set up the YouTube channel, is because YouTube is much more of a one-way street. Like you make the videos, you put them up, and then you get comments on them, right? But it's not like Facebook, where you have these like back and forth debates, and you have these keyboard warriors so convinced about, they're on a mission to prove all these people wrong or whatever. So yeah, I don't use any full spectrum lighting in my snakes. I think a couple of things to consider. No full spectrum lighting can even come close to replicating the sun. I mean, it's just ridiculous to try to think that you're going to create natural light. The sun is a huge ball of, gas and helium and hydrogen, and, putting off huge amounts of energy, millions and millions of miles away. Like, we're going to replicate that with a light bulb. So that's my first thing I'll say. The second thing is that most snakes in the wild are hiding. Okay, they don't try to hide it. They don't try to lie out in the sun. I mean, some people will say, well, the snake could bask for heat. But typically, snakes don't do that. They hide. They go under rocks and logs. If they're living in a tropical forest, there's not that much sun that's getting down to the floor of the forest anyway. So there's not getting a lot of solar radiation that way. And they're typically hiding away. I mean, snakes like dark. They go to hiding places. So these whole debates about full spectrum lighting, for me, it just doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't jive with my own experience of animals appearing perfectly healthy and living long lives and reproducing without it. I mean, can I say 100% that there are no benefits? No, I can't say that. Maybe there are. I don't know. But for my particular situation, I don't see any need or any reason to do that. So my animals seem to be doing fine, without it. And I would say, like I said, do what works for you. Don't really worry about what someone else is saying, because 90% of the information out there is wrong anyway, including what you'll see on my channel. I'll vouch for that. There's a lot of wrong information. What I say on my channel might be right for me, but it might not be right for you. So,
sure. Yeah. I think that's everybody needs to adopt that. I mean, just because I set up my enclosures the way I do, I don't think anybody else should do that. It's your animals, and it's your choice, and people that are breeding that have hundreds of snakes, it would just be insane to, be decorating with foliage and UV lighting and all that.
Yeah.
So when you feed, what are you looking for in the ideal prey item? Are you looking for something about the width of the animal? How do you gauge that with babies all the way through adulthood?
Yeah, I mean, typically it's about the width of the animal. It should leave a barely visible bulge. You shouldn't see a huge bulge. And so typically the babies are starting off on like fuzzy mice, and then, moving to like a small hopper size, and then just kind of moving up. And most of them are eating like kind of a small adult mouse by a year of age. A lot of people will start on rats, and there's a lot of debate about which is better for nutrition and for preventing regurgitation. I don't have any conclusive argument for either of them being better. I think it's probably more just the overall quality. And I've even seen nutritional analyses that show, varying results. So, I guess some people claim that, one is higher in fat than another, but I don't think that there's, at least from what I can find, there's no concrete documentation of that. I think in general, sometimes with smaller animals like fuzz or, pinky or fuzzy rats, for example, maybe they're higher in fat, or, I've heard that if they have milk in them from nursing from the mother rat, that's bad, and that can lead to issues. I don't know if that's 100% true or not, but typically I don't move them to rats until they're, usually about 2 years old. I'll feed them mice throughout their first year or two, and they go up to the larger and jumbo size mice. And then I start them off on like kind of a small rat. And usually by the time they're about 3, they're on kind of medium rats. But it, varies based on the individual boa and the type of boa. I often will also feed quail as well, since they like to have the birds. It adds, variety, and they seem to really enjoy that. And I've also seen that sometimes I will have a few boas that are reluctant feeders. I mean, boas in general are some of the easiest animals to get feeding. But every once in a while, I'll have a boa that for whatever reason just isn't as vigorous as a feeder. And it always seems like these are the animals that I want to get ready for breeding, and they don't want to eat. But I've noticed that if I feed them quail instead, they eat it, every single time. So that's one thing to consider if you have an animal that's a little reluctant around feeding. Another. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, do you ever feed rabbits or anything like that to any of your really large snakes?
I don't feed rabbits. A lot of people do. Basically, rats and quail have worked fine for me. Part of it is just been that rabbits are more expensive for the same size of animal, and it's I've had good luck with rats and quail. I also feed chickens of the varying sizes. Like my big Indian python gets large chickens, but I'll feed chicks or even smaller chickens to some of my boas as well. But yeah, there's no reason. Rabbits are fine. There's a whole bunch of things that they could be fed. I mean, gerbils, hamsters, even an occasional guinea pig would probably be okay. But they're higher in fat. I've heard about squirrels. I've heard people that hunt squirrels and feed them. I would just say to, you want to freeze it ahead of time, but there's no reason why that couldn't be a suitable prey item.
I've never thought about squirrels.
Yeah, I mean, they're everywhere. They're like a pest species.
Yeah. Do you plan on pairing up your Indian python?
Well, my Indian python, I just have the male, so I don't plan on breeding that one. And he's like 20 years old at this point, so he's probably I don't know how much longer he's going to be around, but he still seems very healthy, and he's in really good shape. My Sri Lankan pythons, I don't know. People are asking me about them. I really got them more as a pet than as for breeding. The laws that you can't. It's illegal to sell animals across state lines. So there's this tricky situation with how the laws are around those animals, and also because I'm only working with boas. I don't have any incubators, and I haven't, other than my milk snakes way back in the day, which I had eggs from. Those are the only egg-laying snakes that I've reproduced. Everything else has been my boas.
What's the ideal temperature for a gravid female boa?
I maintain them basically the same as I maintain during the rest of the year. I have a hot spot of 88 to 90, and typically they'll coil tightly around the hot spot to maintain the temperature. I usually use my temp gun and just kind of check out their temperature. And usually their body temperature is reading like 86 to 88. And that's a very good sign that they're gravid. If they're sitting on a hot spot and they're maintaining a high body temperature, chances are pretty good there's something inside of them. And, it might not be live babies, it might be slugs, unfortunately, but they're at least gravid.
Yeah. So when you were in the biology field, how much did your snake keeping impact that profession?
Really, I mean, it kind of got me to pursue, my degree, and then I ended up going into biopharmaceuticals and drug development, and my official work is I'm a toxicologist, but my training is as a molecular biologist. But unfortunately, it kind of my career went a different path, so I don't really do anything related to the reptiles for my day job. But just that, I feel like my background in biology is definitely influenced how I approach my reptile hobby. And the reptile hobby was a major reason why I went into biology to begin with. So it's kind of gone full circle.
That's awesome. I was curious because when I Googled you, I mean, it's funny. First, I was reading the reptiles article that you have out, and I saw the last name, and I didn't connect two and two. I didn't connect Brian Boas with the last name and the published article there, and in Reptiles, which was fantastic. It's a great read. It's a great resource.
Oh, thank you.
If anybody is still subscribed to Reptiles, which I think everybody in the industry should be. I think it's still a fun thing to pull the magazine out of the mailbox and read through and get exposed to things that you wouldn't normally otherwise look at. But yeah, when I Googled your last name, I saw that there was some published papers, and you brought up lung cancer, and so that was you then, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, most of my published papers are on lung cancer, lung disease, drug development. Not really on reptiles. Yeah, I mean, my reptiles article might be, I think that's my only publication that's actually on reptiles. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, anyone out there that's doing reptile research and, I want access to a captive collection of different locality boas. I've got lots of skins. I mean, there's a lot of different genetic studies that we could do on my animals. I have pretty good documentation of, actually where they came from.
Are you friends with Dr. Warren Booth?
Do you know? I watched your podcast with him, and I enjoyed that discussion a lot. And I think he was looking for skins I think it was about 10 years ago, or maybe a little longer. I remember maybe it was him. Someone was looking for skins from different locality boas, and this is back before I had a very large collection.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time there were a few big names who unfortunately they're no longer in boas, but the big names at the time, I guess, were reluctant. It seemed like they were reluctant to share the skins with them for whatever reason. But and I don't know, I could be wrong. I'm just basing this based on comments on the online forums. But yeah, no, I always have a lot of ideas. I mean, I really enjoyed that, putting together that article for Reptiles, and I'm, really happy that it, was able to get it published. But I'm also big into photography, and most of my photography has been like landscape photography. So for many years, I did large format landscape photography when I was in New Mexico and traveling all over the Southwest. And I've gotten more into the reptile photography since I've grown my collection of boas. So it was great to get some of my boa photographs published as well.
That's awesome.
But yeah, what you were saying about reptiles, I subscribed to Reptiles from the first issue in '93. I remember getting it at my local pet shop and being so excited and signed up for a subscription right away. And I continued to subscribe until around 2000. And at that point, I still had Reptiles, but wasn't quite as into the whole, reptile hobby side of it, so to speak. I just had my animals that I kept. And I guess I kind of felt like I had already seen enough in reptile. Like there's obviously certain topics that are just going to be repeated at some point.
Sure.
But I even had the full set of issues from '93 until 2000. Wow. And then like an idiot, about 15 years ago, I was going through stuff and I'm like, yeah, I got to get rid of stuff. So I ended up only keeping about a dozen issues and I threw away the rest, which I really regret. But anyway, so then like last year, I'm thinking, hey, I could write articles now. I have enough experience that I could share some of what I've been doing, right? And so I found the Reptiles website and I found their Facebook page and I reached out to the editor and proposed an article, and they said, yeah, write the article, and really happy with how it turned out. And but what was weird was they told me my article was going to be published, and I said, oh, cool, where can I get it? I want to see it in print, right? They sent me a PDF, but having a digital copy is not the same thing as having the actual print, right? So I started to look around at bookstores and pet stores, and there wasn't a single bookstore that carried Reptiles magazine. And I'm thinking that's weird because back in the day, I would go to Borders and Barnes and Noble, and they'd have Reptiles, they'd have the Vivarium, Reptile and Amphibian. They would have like a whole bunch of reptile magazines, but they don't have any more. And so then I thought, well, maybe it's just because I'm in California. And I was actually visiting some of my family in South Carolina over the summer. And I made my wife go out of our way to stop at the Barnes & Noble so I could go in there and see. And I went in there and they had magazines. They didn't have a single reptile magazine. They had very few like the old school magazines I used to read, like photography magazines. It was all like they had like a whole rack of magazines devoted to Taylor Swift. They had a whole bunch of like YouTube magazines. But nothing. I mean, it was really kind of sad, because
magazines devoted to visual and audio.
Yeah, it's like when I was a teenager and a young adult, I would spend a lot of time at the bookstore, right? Borders and Barnes and Noble. I would camp out there. I'd read all the books. I'd read all the magazines. Occasionally I'd buy something, but I have like this visceral reaction to like a bookstore smell, like something about bookstores. It's almost like it excites me, smelling the smell of the paper and the printing or whatever it is, So when I went into the Barnes and Noble in South Carolina, I smelled that and I got really excited. It's like magazines, right? And I saw the magazine rack and I'm all psyched and I'm looking around. I'm like, where the hell are all the good magazines, right? And like, I'm 50 now, right? But I was going back to like being like 23, right? And it was really sad because I felt like just trying to relive my life like it was back in the day, and they just didn't have the same magazines. So then I found out, I reached out to the editor and I'm like, can I get a copy? I can't find it. And he said, well, you can subscribe. And then I went and
they couldn't hook you up with a copy.
Well, I didn't really pressure them. I don't think, honestly, Reptiles magazine has changed ownership a few times. And I didn't, since 2000, I'm ashamed to say I hadn't read a single issue in print since 2000.
Almost a quarter century.
Yeah, so it was a quarter century, and then I go back and I ask them if they'll publish my paper or my article. But so I felt a little bad about that actually. But I figured I could get it at bookstores, and I was shocked to find out that people don't really read magazines anymore. I went to this pet store that used to have magazines, and they told me, yeah, we stopped stocking magazines 2 years ago.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm living in the past. I'm the guy. I went to Blockbuster Video in 2004 looking for VHS tapes. I mean, Blockbuster was on the verge of closing, and I'm looking for VHS tapes. That tells you kind of where I'm living. But and then the girl looks at me like, "What the hell's a VHS tape?" Right? And anyway, no more magazines. So I subscribed, which I'm happy about, and I was happy I got my subscription in time. My first issue was, this one, which is it's my Peruvian boa on the cover.
Oh yeah.
And I got my second issue right here. But yeah, I really recommend anybody thinking about subscribing, please subscribe to this magazine. There's a lot of really good content, lots of beautiful pictures, a lot of stuff you can't get online, and it's really cheap. It costs $20 a year. I mean, it's for the price of a McDonald's meal, you can get a year subscription to Reptiles.
Yeah, and the payoff is that you get to just read about a specific animal, and like I said, it exposes you to things that you would probably never look at.
Yeah, exactly.
and
There's a lot of stuff in there. It's not available online. There's a lot of in-depth articles about reptiles like I never heard of. And like for me, since I'm set in boas, I'm not gonna probably go out and start new projects on other species. And I have my my bucket list in my head that most of which I'll never unfortunately get to keep. But for someone that's newer to reptiles and wants to see what's out there, do not just base it on what's online or what's at a reptile show. A lot of people go to reptile shows. I have kind of mixed feelings about reptile shows, and I've even done videos about this. I don't personally sell at reptile shows. I'm not against reptile shows. For some people, it's a great thing, and for some people, it makes a lot of sense. It just doesn't really make much sense for me. And I feel like I am missing out on a lot of the social aspects because I don't go to the reptile shows, but there are just certain things that it just doesn't fit me, right? So, but if you go to a reptile show, you're going to have this impression that, 80% of what people are keeping are ball pythons and, a few types of geckos. And, there's certainly nothing wrong with those. But there's just so much more out there, to discover. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
what this, Reptiles magazine is really good for, is they have a lot of diversity of different species that, a lot of people have never heard of.
Yeah. It's great to get exposure to other aspects of the hobby, especially since we're kind of a Google culture now. So it's you Google and then you're just exposed to the things that you're interested in, so
yeah,
that's an awesome way to see new things and learn new things for sure. All right. Well, thanks, Brian. It's been
it's been a pleasure. Yeah. And, thanks for having me on. And, I hope our conversation is helpful for people. But, if you're watching this, feel free to reach out to me. I try to get back to everyone who reaches out to me. If I can't go in depth, I at least try to respond as, time allows. And
so people can find you on Facebook, right? Are you on Instagram or just Facebook?
Yeah, no, I'm on all of them. So Facebook is Brian Boas or Brian Vuillemenot Boa. So basically my last name with the word boa at the end minus the NOT. Basically, long story, when I set up the Facebook account, I wanted to be somewhat anonymous because I wanted it to just be for my boas. And I didn't want to use my name because then people from outside of my boa life would be able to find me. And I didn't want it like for exchanging like family photos or anything like that. So it was Brian Vuillemenot Boa. Actually, it was first Brian Boas, but then Facebook, I guess, figured out that wasn't my real name. So then I started calling it Brian Vuillemenot Boa. And then when I set up the YouTube channel, I just called it Brian Boas.
And you sell all of your animals through Flickr?
Yeah, well, I don't sell through Flickr is my image hosting site. So if you go to my videos, if you look under the video description, there's a link to the Flickr site, and that's where I put pictures of the available babies. But if you basically people can contact me through my email. It's under the video description. It's cleowolf@yahoo.com. But if you go to any of my videos, it's under the description. You could also message me through Facebook, either through the Brian Vuillemenot page or through Brian Boas. There's another site on page on Facebook that's just Brian Boas. It gets hard to keep track of sometimes with all these social media accounts. And then Instagram, I think it's Vuillemenot is my Instagram handle.
Okay.
Although Instagram, I don't use all that much. Occasionally I'll upload photos there from my phone, but they make it difficult, if not impossible, to upload photos from a camera. It's just from the phone.
Oh,
and most
yeah,
of my serious reptile photography, I'm not using my phone for. So
yeah, you got to transfer it over to the phone, and it's a whole pain in the ass. So I was looking at your Flickr account, and all this will be in the description for this video too, and I'll put your email there too if anybody wants to reach out to you. But
cleowolf@yahoo.com.
Yeah, I'll throw that in as well. I've got the Facebook and links to all that. You don't have any Argentine babies right now, right? They're all gone?
Actually, no, I do. I have
son of a gun.
I think I got 5 left actually from
I wish I would have hit you up. I think I hit you up earlier this year or late last year on a YouTube video. I was like, do you have any Argentines? And you were like, not right now. And
I must have just sold out from last year.
So sad.
They're
beautiful.
Know. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have any next year. I got my female that bred in 23. I could breed her, but she's kind of a reluctant feeder, and she's one of the ones that I've been feeding quail lately because she really prefers those over rats. I'm not sure if I'm going to breed her or not. Next year I'm not going to have as many pairings as I had this year. This year was just crazy, so I'm going to pare it back a bit next year, but I'll still have quite a bit. And
how many animals do you have altogether?
I don't know. Over 100. Anyway, that's one of the questions. It's like asking someone their age or their body weight. You know?
Yeah. Well, you already told me how old you are.
It depends upon. I mean, well, you could just look me up online and figure out my age. Yeah. No, I mean, it depends if you count babies or if you count just adults. You know.
Yeah. Well, your Argentine boas are fantastic. They're beautiful. If anybody wants one, the prices that I saw on your Flickr page are awesome. They're for the quality animal you're getting. They're very, very well priced.
Thank you. You know, I try to keep it reasonable without setting it too low.
Yeah. No, they're phenomenally priced. I saw that, and I was now that you're telling me you have some, I'm very sad that I filled up my spots already for Argentine boas. I mean, what's one more giant boa, you know? All right. Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Adam. It's been great, and best of luck with your podcast and reptile keeping.
Thank you so much, sir.
All right. Yeah. Take care.